Hi, and welcome to Changes for the 2018-19 USPAP. My name is John Brenan, Director of Appraisal Issues, and I'm here with Maggie Hambleton, the Chair of the Appraisal Standards Board. Thanks for joining us today, Maggie.
You're welcome, John. Thanks for letting me join with you on this.
Great. Well, we want to talk about the changes that the Standards Board made for 2018-19, but before we talk about those changes, let's talk about how we got there. The Standards Board proposes all changes in documents open to the public and requests public feedback and public comments. The way that the changes for 2018-19 came about started with a discussion draft that the Standards Board issued in January of 2016. Based on the feedback received, the Standards Board issued a first exposure draft in April, and then a second exposure draft in August after receiving feedback from the first. Likewise, the third exposure draft was issued in December after having gone through all the feedback that was received from the second. Ultimately, the Standards Board adopted the changes on February 3rd at its public meeting, as all changes to the standards are always adopted in public meetings. Completely transparent process. And ultimately, the new USPAP will be available on October 1st, as will all of the USPAP courses. So with that, let's dive into what the changes themselves were. If you would like to look at a detailed version of the changes, the summary of actions is available on our website. There are actually two documents. One is a basic short summary of what the changes were, and then within that document, you can click on a link to go to the full detailed version, which actually shows how those changes appear in USPAP. So the first change we've got here is a change to the definition of report, and we've added a phrase, as you see, that says, or a party authorized by the client, and we've removed a comment. Maggie, can you tell us what this change was about and maybe provide an example that illustrates it?
Sure, John. Let's suppose for a minute that a client says to an appraiser, I'm going to be out of the country for the next month and want you to send the completed appraisal report to my attorney. Under the existing USPAP definition, it's not really clear whether this would be considered a report or just a document. Adding the new phrase, or a party authorized by the client, makes it much more clear that this in fact is an appraisal report.
Great. What do you see as the impact for this on an appraiser's day-to-day practice?
Well, actually, the effect on everyday practice is minimal, as the revised definition is now more consistent with common practice. Reports are routinely transmitted to AMCs, for example, rather than the actual client themselves.
And what about the comment? Why was that deleted?
Well, the comment was eliminated because it was no longer necessary to the definition.
I see. Great. Well, let's look at the next change. We actually have a couple of changes here to the conduct section of the ethics rule, and it looks like assignment results have been added to a report for both of the bullets. What's this all about?
Okay, well, if you think about it, it's really not unusual for appraisers to communicate with the client during some assignments regarding assignment results, and such communications are not prohibited under USPAP. For example, if you suppose an appraiser was asked to appraise a single unit property. After inspecting the property and collecting all the necessary data, the appraiser concluded that the highest and best use was not really a one-unit dwelling, but a two-unit. The appraiser reported this to the client, and the client cancels the assignment. Although no report was written, the appraiser still expressed assignment results to the client. In our previous editions of USPAP, it addressed the inappropriate communications of reports, but it didn't address the other communications to a client. Therefore, it was necessary to add such communications to the prohibition in the conduct section that addresses the actions of appraisers.
Okay, so we're making clear that fraudulent or misleading, whether it's an actual report or a part of a report, that's not okay.
Right.
And what do you see as the impact on the day-to-day practice for these changes?
Well, again, the impact will be minimal to day-to-day practice, as it's actually an extension of what was already in the ethics rule. It will, however, assist both state regulatory agencies and professional organizations in taking actions against clearly unethical behavior by appraisers.
Okay, great. Let's talk about the next change, which is a change to the record-keeping rule. And this looks a little bit similar to the last changes when it talks about communication of assignment results. Can you tell us more about this, Maggie?
Sure, it is an extension, and the record-keeping rule had required that the work file be in existence prior to issuing a report, but it didn't necessarily mean prior to providing other communications of assignment results. Therefore, the change imposes a work file requirement that prior to any communication of assignment results, not just report, that the work file be in existence. And if you think about this, if you remember my last example, the appraiser reported an assignment result to the client and the client canceled the report. The appraiser would have to have had a work file filed to communicating that assignment result to the client.
Well, that makes sense. You can't communicate assignment results unless you have a basis for those, and that basis would be part of your work file. Now, there's a second change to the record-keeping rule that added an oral appraisal report and then the work file regarding an oral appraisal report. Can you explain that?
Right. The second change actually clarifies the work file requirements for the oral reports, and it also brought into fact an oral appraisal review report, which had not been in the original one.
Great. What kind of impact do you see from these changes?
Okay. Well, in most cases, appraisers begin a work file at the start of an assignment. In those cases, the change will have no impact. But in the example that I just gave, appraisers sometimes wonder if assignment is canceled after an assignment result was communicated to the client and there was no appraisal report, whether or not it was still necessary to maintain a work file. The requirement is now clearer for those who enforce USPAP, that it is required.
Great. Thank you for that. The next change looks like we've got a change in the definition of assignment. What was that change made for?
Well, the existing definition addressed both the client appraiser agreement to provide a service and the service itself. There were some areas in the existing USPAP where it was really unclear whether the term assignment meant the service or the agreement. The Appraisal Standards Board considered other terms for the word agreement, but decided it was unnecessary. So the definition was edited to be more direct.
Okay, I see. There was also a change. A definition of assignment conditions was added. The language looks pretty familiar here. Looks like it might have been in the scope of work rule. Can you explain what was done here?
Yes. This was was actually brought to the ASB's attention during a public meeting. Assignment conditions have a specific meaning in USPAP, and the meaning had been stated in the scope of work rule, but not in the definitions. It also was addressed in the development standards. And since the definition is specific to USPAP, it was decided it should also be in the definitions. The concept is actually essential to the understanding of USPAP and therefore was added.
Great. And assignment conditions, the way this is explained here, does that apply to development and reporting or just appraisal development? Well,
it helps you decide the scope of work, so it's the development part. And I think it's helpful just to remember that in daily practice, that assignment conditions are only those items that affect the appraiser's scope of work.
Great, great. Thank you for that clarification. There was also a revision, looks like some minor revisions, to the definition of intended use. Can you talk about that?
Sure, and you're absolutely right, they were minor. The initial reason that this definition was reviewed related to the use of the term at the time of assignment, which, because assignment, the definition had two actual definitions, it caused confusion. So the change to the definition of assignment resolved the issue, but other minor changes were made for the sake of consistency and clarity. I
see. Is this something that you think would have a significant impact on an appraiser's day-to-day practice?
Not on the day-to-day practice as much as on the overall impact of the intent and application of USPAP, because this becomes much clearer to both users of appraisal services and appraisers.
Great. The next change we have is a definition of intended user. Now this looks to be fairly similar in concept to the last one. Can you explain this one?
Well, the same rationale goes along with the definition of intended use. At the same time, we looked at intended user, and as you can see, if you're looking at the definition on your screen, that we only made one slight adjustment to make it, again, much more clear in the understanding of the definition itself.
Great, thank you. The next change we have is edits to the competency rule, and it looks like we're talking about making a change from accepting an assignment to agreeing to perform. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Sure. The being competent section of the competency rule stated in part, prior to accepting an assignment. Given the prior definition of assignment, this is awkward. So with the revised definition, evaluation service provided by an appraiser, the phrase is actually out of context. There was a reference in the comment to the same section that referred to the time of the assignment. It was suggested this could be more clearly stated. The result is the language here is clearer and much more direct.
I see. And what do you foresee as the impact for this change?
Well, the change is actually the intent and application of USPAP is much more clear. And it actually says agreeing to perform an assignment, and that's what we're actually doing by the new definition of assignment.
Great, thank you. The next change is, it looks like the definition of assumption has been deleted. What's that all about?
Well, the definition of assumption in USPAP was that which is taken to be true, and that is the same as the common English usage definition. Therefore, it's been removed from the definitions in USPAP, although the term is still used. The definitions in USPAP are specific to USPAP, and since this wasn't, it was no longer necessary. But we do want to remember that appraisers are still obligated to determine what assumptions exist in each appraisal assignment that they do.
Okay, so we took the definition out because it is the same as the English definition and it doesn't have a special meaning in USPAP. That makes sense. There was also a change to extraordinary assumption. What was that about?
Okay, so if you think about it, multiple stakeholders had expressed concern that the difference between assumption and an extraordinary assumption was actually unclear. A primary reason for differentiating between extraordinary assumption and other assumptions is that an extraordinary assumption is critical, that the intended users understand that there was some atypical condition that necessitates its use, and that the use may affect the assignment results.
Well, that's great. You know, we're talking about assumption and extraordinary assumption, and that's a question that we get a lot. You know, a lot of appraisers sometimes have difficulty understanding the distinction between an assumption and an extraordinary assumption. Do you have an example you could give that might help illustrate this?
Sure. Let's suppose that an appraiser inspects the property and sees nothing out of the ordinary. The appraisal then assumes the property is free of environmental contamination. This is what we call an ordinary assumption. Now, suppose an appraiser inspects a property and sees some 55-gallon drums at the rear of the property, some of which show signs of leakage. The appraiser is actually unable to determine what the drums were filled with, but performs the appraisal using the extraordinary assumption that there is no environmental contamination as a result of the drums.
Well, that is a good way to distinguish between an assumption and an extraordinary assumption. So by removing the definition of assumption and revising extraordinary assumption, what impact do you think that will have?
Well, the revised definition of extraordinary assumption is intended to stress that the extraordinary assumptions are assignment specific and that intended users will not understand the report properly unless they are aware of such extraordinary assumptions. Appraisers continue to have the obligation to determine which assumptions are of a general nature and which are extraordinary. Although the definition of assumption has been removed, the term assumption is still used in USPAP and its meaning is unchanged.
Great, thank you. Let's look at the next change, which was the definition of appraisal review. Can you tell us why the board opted to make a revision for this definition?
Yes, USPAP recognizes a difference between the process of developing an opinion and the communication of an opinion once it's been developed. The definition of appraisal review was changed to more closely parallel the definition of appraisal, since the existing definition of appraisal review included both development and reporting. Since all of the standards now clearly separate development and reporting, the definition of review should also be limited to development. Additionally, the definition of report historically has included both appraisal and appraisal review. So now we're making them closely parallel in the development also.
I see. Okay, great. The next change is that standard 3, what we've known for many years, is appraisal review, development, and reporting, has been split into two standards. Standard 3 for appraisal review development and standard 4 for appraisal review reporting. Why was that done, Maggie?
Well, it goes along with what I just talked about on the definition. Appraisal has separate development and reporting standards, while both development and reporting for appraisal review, as you said, had been addressed in standard 3. Since standard 4, which used to be appraisal consulting development, was retired several years ago, it seemed logical to go ahead and separate reporting into its own standard for appraisal review or make it standard 4.
Great. So by splitting standard 3 into standard 3 and 4, what type of impact does that have on appraisers?
Well, the performance-related expectations that are placed on appraisers have not actually changed. The same work for appraisal review is still required. But USPAP is now more consistent, and the requirements that apply to appraisal assignments and appraisal review assignments, again, are more parallel to one another.
I see. And our next change looks like we have something similar here. Standard 6 mass appraisal has been split into standard 5, the development of mass appraisal, and standard 6, the reporting. Can you, is that the same type of rationale for why this was done as standard 3 was done?
Yes, generally the same reasons that were discussed regarding appraisal review apply here. Standard 5, which used to be appraisal consulting, the reporting part of it, was also retired. So again, it was logical to make standard 5 mass appraisal development. Additionally, the old standard 6 had not been reviewed in any kind of depth for over 10 years. So it was suggested that the ASB consult with mass appraisal experts to ensure that USPAP was appropriate and reflected any recent changes to that field. Experts were consulted and they made several recommendations. These recommendations were used to propose several changes throughout the process to mass appraisal.
Well, great. And is this similar to the change made for Standard 3? What type of impact will this have? Will this change how mass appraisal are developed and reported?
No, but USPAP again is more consistent, and the requirements that apply to appraisal assignments and mass appraisal assignments are now more clearly parallel also. So it makes all of our development and reporting standards much more uniform, and so it would be easy to transition from one discipline to another.
And we once again have 10 full standards, which is nice. When people that are not familiar with the document look and see there were not 10 full standards, they sometimes ask why. So that's good. The next changes involve Standard 7, Personal Property Appraisal Development, and Standard 8, Personal Property Appraisal Reporting. Can you tell us more about these changes? Maybe provide an example that might help illustrate what was done here?
Sure, John. I'll give it my best shot. We have two great personal property appraisers on our board, as a matter of fact. But it came to our attention that market value is seldom used in personal property appraising. Therefore, the term was eliminated from Standards 7 and 8. Edits then were also proposed to make Standards 7 and 8 more consistent with current practice in the personal property discipline. One example is in the area of Standards Rule 8-3, which is the certification requirement, its comment. And so for kind of an example to illustrate what the change was, in some personal property assignments, there are sometimes multiple appraisers with varying areas of specialties who may work together in an assignment. In these cases, there was concern regarding the requirement that each appraiser must sign the certification, and each was therefore accepting responsibility for the entire report. Standards Rule 8-3 was changed to accommodate such instances, allowing the individual appraisers to take responsibility for their part of the total report only.
Okay, great. So how does this impact personal property appraisers?
Well, USPAP now is more consistent with the language that is used and the practice commonly provided by personal property appraisers.
So a lot of these changes have been made to make USPAP more consistent and more clear, and it really kind of reflects that there aren't as many differences in disciplines as many people have thought. So I think that's a good thing.
I do too.
Great. We also made some changes to advisory opinions. Advisory opinion, we can start with the first one here, which is Advisory Opinion 1, Sales History. Can you tell us why that was changed, Maggie?
Yes, in real property market value appraisal assignments, USPAP has requirements addressing analysis of all agreements of sales, options or listings of the subject current as of the effective date, and all sales within 3 years prior to the effective date of value. The guidance provided in AO1 focused only on situations where information was not available to the appraiser. Regulators and users of appraisal services expressed concern to us that the reports included information regarding sales and listings, but actually had no analysis. So extensive changes were made to AO1 and include, I should say, many new illustrations of how various required analyses may be reported by the appraisers. So it's offering some different guidance than perhaps we have before. So I recommend that everybody take a look at the new, or the new and improved, should I say, Sales History Advisory Opinion.
Great. And so that sounds like it'll make things a little clearer And you mentioned there's also examples that appraisers will now have to also help the understanding of the intent of the AO.
That's correct. Yeah, there are several examples that could be included in a report as a summary of an analysis.
Great. That is something we often hear, that an appraisal report may just state what was done in terms of a prior sale, but there isn't any real analysis. So I think that's a great addition. We have the next one up on the list is Advisory Opinion 21, USPAP compliance. Can you tell us what changed in that AO?
Right. Well, this one, we added an additional graphic that replaced an old table. And the purpose of this new illustration was to more clearly indicate which parts of USPAP apply to various types of assignments. So it gives direct correlation between an assignment and the areas in USPAP which would be used in developing that assignment. And the graphic actually, if you look at it full on, shows the flexibility that we do have in USPAP.
Well, that's great. That clarification is important because many appraisers do sometimes have difficulty discerning between appraisal practice and valuation services. And this table that was removed is not the one that is the graphic with the concentric circles that everybody has come to know and love over the years. So hopefully it won't be too controversial.
No, it wasn't. During the exposure process, everybody seemed to like this, and the stakeholders suggested a few tweaks, but beyond that, the original illustration was pretty much left intact.
Great. Well, let's talk about the next AO, Advisory Opinion 31, assignments involving more than one appraiser. What was changed here?
Well, if you think about it, there was some concern expressed that since significant appraisal assistance is not a term that's described in USPAP, stakeholders took a look and said, we really need more guidance on this. And so a new section was added to AO 31 to provide such guidance in determining what constitutes significant appraisal assistance, and a new illustration was also provided. And again, it's very down real world type illustrations, so I think they'll be appreciated by the stakeholders who were concerned.
Well, that sounds like a great addition because yes, many appraisers have appraisers and others have sometimes questioned exactly what significant appraisal assistance means. So that sounds great. The next one up is a revisions to Advisory Opinion 32, ad valorem property tax appraisal and mass appraisal assignments. I'm guessing this might have something to do with the changes from standard 6 to 5 and 6. Is that right?
You're right. You just took the words almost out of my mouth, John. So if you think about it, since we did revise standard 5 and 6 after talking to experts in the field, then it was logical to get their help in also taking a look at the advisory opinion, and it was substantially rewritten. So if you're in the mass appraisal discipline, or if you have an interest in looking at that, it's a very helpful, I think, AO to get some kind of understanding of what mass appraising is all about.
Great, thank you. We have one more on the list here, and this is actually a new AO, the creation of Advisory Opinion 37, Computer-Assisted Valuation Tools. Why was this created? Don't we have Advisory Opinion 18 about automated valuation models?
We do, and I'm going to kind of take that little part of the question first, and then I'll give you the rationale about the new AO. And if you think back with me, and those of you that have followed the process along from our discussion draft through the whole procedure, actually it was suggested that due to the reduced usage of AVMs by appraisers, the guidance regarding the AVMs should be retired, or AO 18. But when this was exposed, the ASB received considerable feedback that suggested it should be retained, and another AO added that dealt with other computer-assisted valuation tools. And so that's exactly what we did. We undertook a creation of a new AO 37, and the use of various computer-assisted tools by appraisers have become much more common. But appraisers have certain obligations when they use these tools. The USPAP publication already had advisory opinions addressing such issues as the automated valuation models that I already talked about, and discuss discounted cash flow analysis, or DCFs. There was no guidance for other automated valuation tools. So this new AO takes you through a series of different tools, and just from an overview process, of course.
Things that are much more common today for appraisers, like regression analysis and such. That's what we're talking about. Right.
And so if you look at it now, appraisers will have an additional resource for USPAP-related guidance in this in the use of computer-assisted valuation tools. So, we hope that it's going to be another helpful AO. We feel it is, because, as you know, that board members do have all appraisers on it. So.
Great. Well, thank you, Maggie. We do have our information on the screen if there are any questions pertaining to this webinar, if there are questions pertaining to the changes to USPAP, our phone number, website, email address, and our Q&A forum are all shown on the screen, and we would encourage you to reach out. With that, Maggie, I'd like to thank you so much for being with us today, and appreciate everybody who has participated in the webinar.
Well, it was my pleasure being here. I always like to do these with you, John, and I hope that it will be helpful to those of you that are viewing the webinar.
Great. Thanks again, everyone.